Welcome to Litigation Psychology Podcast, brought to you by Courtroom Sciences, Inc. I'm Dr. Steve Wood. With me, Dr. Bill Kanasky. Bill, I see you're out enjoying the weather today there in Florida.
It's 79 degrees and sunny. I got the beautiful landscape behind me. I am not shoveling snow like those poor people up in Chicago and Boston and Wisconsin. That's why I live in Florida, right here.
Yeah, as a Midwesterner originally, I do not miss shoveling snow. So I agree. I'm all for the hot weather. It's about getting in the 80s here in Texas as well. So
Yeah,
things are good. Baseball season's right around the corner, so life is
well,
good.
it may not be around the corner, Steve.
Well, yeah, this is true. MLB baseball is not around the corner. My son's baseball is around the corner.
Well, there you go.
That might be more enjoyable at this point than
At this point, it may be more enjoyable.
So, Bill,
I got a rant.
I know it's coming. I know we've had these conversations, and I'm ready to hear what you got to rant about today.
I've been ranting about it all week. Okay, and I'm going to call this the Valentines Day Rant. Valentine's Day. You are aware Valentine's Day is not a holiday. You're aware of that, right?
It depends.
It's okay. Well, what's this? What did you go through? Did you go through CSI's witness training program?
I did.
It's not. It's not a holiday. Okay. Christmas is a holiday. Thanksgiving's a holiday. Okay. Valentine's Day. Are you taking off Monday? You're not going to work on Monday? No, you're going to work, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
After the Super Bowl, so it might be a little rough going to work, but I will be there.
This is true. I don't know why they do. I tell you what. Okay, so last year, revenue from Valentine's Day. Ready for this? $18.6 billion.
Wow.
Let me repeat, $18.6 billion. And I'm just blindsided by that. That's a lot of money, Steve. And I have this. First off, if you're married, okay, you're done with Valentine's Day, period. It's over. You're married, okay? You know, you're in high school or you're in college and you're chasing that special somebody around. Hey, go buy your roses, go buy your candy that nobody's gonna eat. Okay, it's a lot of money. And by the way, have you ever tried to get a dinner reservation?
Oh, it's brutal.
Yeah. You can't do it.
Yeah,
absolutely can't do it. Now I'm gonna read. Now this is what I'm gonna do, a little history lesson for you. I'm not going to share my screen, but I'm going to go to this webpage because they came out with an article yesterday. Okay, Valentine's Day dates back to 6th century BC. And ready for this? It was a sexually charged and violent rite involving the sacrifice of dogs and male goats to promote fertility. Are you following me here?
I'm following. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. I'm gonna keep. Yeah, because you may want to second think those roses when I tell you this, right? Okay, priests had their foreheads anointed with the blood from the sacrificial knife, and then the knife was wiped clean with wool soaked in milk. The priest would later cut strips of goat hide and, ready for this, run naked throughout the city, whipping nearby women with the bloody hide. The whole thing was designed to promote fertility. There's a lot to process there, Steve, but I see
where your angst comes from.
I'm just saying, this is the origins of the holiday, right? And then obviously now it's changed, but I don't know if I want to support a holiday that, you know, you got naked priests running around whipping women with hides. I don't understand that.
Yeah. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Kim's not getting flowers this year.
Well, see, it's her birthday too, so I get double doinked on that. I get double doinked, but I tend to go away. Hallmark's not getting a nickel of my money. Like, I'll get gifts, but the flowers, candy thing, it's out of control. And then if you don't do it, oh, well then, you know, now you're going to be, you know, ostracized out of your neighborhood or whatever. I'm just telling you, it's worse than Halloween. It's worse than all these things combined. It's a Hallmark holiday that $18.6 billion. You know, you could raise that and solve all kinds of problems in this world, but no, we're going to go blow it on roses and flowers that are going to die and candy that you're going to get by the third piece. You're like, why am I doing this? And you're going to throw it out. So it's not like, it's not even a good investment. And honestly, if you really love somebody, why are we doing this one day a year? Right? I mean, shouldn't you tell that special somebody, you know, I'm saying you have to give them roses and candy every day, but you know, one day a year, I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. Okay, that's my it's my Valentine's Day rant. I've had enough of it.
Yeah. All right. Today we want to talk about something that's probably not much lighter, and probably even worse, right? We're going to be talking more
Yeah.
today about those difficult cases that you and I have worked on that involve bad outcomes for children, correct?
Birth injury cases. I've been working on birth injury cases for 18 years. They're some of the most difficult I've seen for a number of reasons. You know, juror sympathy is always going to be there in most cases. And there's certain parts about these cases that you and I see kind of over and over that I thought we should talk about. I made a list because we see them as we do mock trials and focus groups and witness training. These are kind of things that always come up. And the first thing on my list, which may be the obvious, is that in the vast majority of these cases, you have the physician that's not employed by the hospital as a co-defendant, and then the nursing staff and maybe the hospitalist or something underneath the hospital umbrella. And from what you and I have seen lately, you know, sometimes the jury kind of favors one party more than the other. And I think that particularly in deposition testimony, some of the things we've been seeing, I mean, those types of situations are ripe for conflict. And we were just doing one of these the other day. And what I've heard a million times, which by the way is true, you know, jurors are like, well, you know, nurses are the ones spending 90% of the time with the patient versus the doctor. And do you think the fact, A, that is true, and B, that always comes up in the juror mind, do you think that maybe sets up the physician to have a tougher time in litigation versus the nursing staff?
Uh, yeah, I would say I think one of the biggest things with doctors, right, is the nurses are spending a lot of time with the patient, but ultimately the buck stops with the doctor, right? So they're the ones who have to make the decisions. They're the ones that have to make the tough calls, and they get information from the nurses. But like I said, ultimately, when the decision flows up to them and their ultimate decision maker, that does
Yeah.
create a problem. And it also creates a problem as far as, you know, if we've seen before where one doctor might say they didn't know a certain piece of information that would have been beneficial, jurors then will say, well, why didn't you ask? Why didn't you reach out? Why didn't you get that information? So they do have a
Yeah.
tougher time to say, not be able to say that they don't know to things that they should know about.
Yeah, and that's the next thing on my list, which again came up in some of our more recent projects. It's been coming up, and it's such a simple theme for the plaintiff. Is in our recent focus group, jurors were not happy with the healthcare communication between professionals,
Yeah.
and that's a major problem. I think it's a problem for both parties, whether you're with the hospital or with the physician. But it's just such an easy argument to make from the plaintiff side, saying, "Hey, you know, this birth injury was preventable. You know, if only the right hand knew what the left hand was doing." And I also think that where the physicians get criticized, and this is just the nature of the industry, these physicians are bouncing around. I mean, they're bouncing around from multiple hospitals, and then when they're in the hospital, multiple patients, and sometimes they're only coming in at the very end. And can you talk a little bit about, you know, some of the juror feedback we've gotten on how they view communication? Sometimes it's not just. I think they expect a lot more than what actually happens because these doctors are bouncing around.
Yeah, they definitely do. And I think one of the other things and it's implicit and understood in the actual medical community, but you know, if a doctor gives a certain order and then the assumption that with that order comes a lot of other steps, that nurse knows that because that nurse has worked with that doctor
Yeah.
and they know what that means to be able to do it. The problem becomes though is you can't go back later and say, oh, well, he made this order, and I assumed that that order meant 3 other orders too that just never made it into the actual chart. And jurors are saying, wait a second, you can't
Yeah.
assume anything. You need to make sure that you have all of the orders in there. It's not enough to just assume or work with them and say, I knew what he meant. Because, like you said, communication becomes
Yeah.
key. And especially when you're talking a situation that could be life threatening and your communication is poor. If anything, jurors have a sense that that's when it needs to be at its top. Like if you and I are talking, via email or just sitting around chatting, there's a different assumption in there versus when we're trying to do something of a medical procedure that's extremely important.
Yeah. Another thing on my list is that the whole concept of having a doctor essentially acting as an independent contractor. Jurors really struggle to understand that, and even though there's a definite legal divide there, I don't think jurors really care. I think they almost assume that even though the physician may not be employed by the hospital, they're part of the hospital is the way a lot of jurors see it.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a key point. Obviously, there's a legal differentiation, and we hear that a lot, right? Is, well, we don't have to worry about it because the doctor is actually independent contractor. He's not an employee of the hospital. The problem is, jurors, patients,
Yeah.
they don't see the badge on there that says independent contractor of hospital, right? They might have credentials
Yeah.
that show the hospital's logo, or they might, you know, patients think they're part of the hospital. The other thing is even if they're not and they're independent contractors and it's clear, jurors will sometimes say, well, who hired them? I mean, you
Yeah.
hired this independent contractor. Are you not, doing your due diligence when you're actually hiring people? So it
Yeah.
makes the hospital really hard to get off the hook on that because either A, they did a bad job hiring them, or B, jurors and patients just assume that they're part of the actual organization.
Yeah, back to the communication part. With our recent project, the one thing that I won't say was shocking, but it was kind of concerning when you have this physician and nurse that have delivered how many babies together, like something ridiculous over multiple years. And because something wasn't documented, the jury, and I think what the nurse's testimony was, and so is the doctor's, like, listen, she knows my next move. I know her next move. We've done this so many times. The fact that I didn't document something is not a big deal here. I know what's going on. We are on the same page professionally. This is what we do. But the jurors really weren't happy with that, were they?
No, no, they weren't. Like I said, that goes back to a couple things they said. One, it goes back to it's not enough to just say you've worked together. If it needs to be documented, it needs to be documented. But then even some of the stuff we heard was they viewed it as complacency, right? They
Yeah.
viewed it as you've delivered so many babies so many times that it just becomes, just another baby that you're delivering so that you get lax in your communication, you get lax in the way you're doing
Yeah.
things. And when that happens, bad stuff happens.
Well, something else that we've been testing a lot, which we kind of I knew the answer to this months and months ago, but it continues. Our theory in this continues to be confirmed. There is no halo effect for hospital systems post COVID. I mean, remember we're like, okay, so what are your opinions of XYZ Medical Center? And what, 95% were like overwhelmingly positive. Yet when
Yeah.
it came to the damages, they got hammered. And even I remember our one juror up in the corner there had said, I think his brother had been to that hospital several times. Like he was just thrilled with this and he was the highest damages award.
Yeah.
I mean, so can you just talk a little about, because I want to make sure everybody understands this. You may have a great reputation, you may have handled COVID well. That ain't going to translate to the deliberation room, is it?
No, and I think one of the things where he was getting at was that he had such a high opinion of this hospital
Mhm.
that when something went wrong, it must have been really, really bad and they must have screwed it up because they tend to do things very,
Yeah.
very well and they tend to do things right. So when something bad happens, it really must have been something bad and they must have had something to do with it.
Yeah. So all this PR and marketing, which I get, which is, they're calling doctors and nurses heroes. When it gets down to the case specifics, I just don't think that really translates to actual juror decision making. Um, and it is what it is, but at least we've done the research to prove that at this point. So now I do think it's important, which, and again, you can't, we were doing more of a focus group model. If we go to a mock trial, we'll have more testimony. I think the way to utilize that is when you have a corporate representative that's testifying, can talk about the values of the healthcare system. I think that's where you get more bang for your buck, but I don't think it's necessary for med mal attorneys or claims people at hospitals or physician insurers to just assume, hey, we're the heroes here. There's no way they're going to side against us and award high damages. That is not the case. They absolutely will. All right, plowing straight ahead, moving down our list. Oh god, fetal monitoring strips. Oh man, I've never seen a jury. I have never seen a jury. I mean, you've seen these. It just looks like a plate of spaghetti with. I mean, you're trying to present these to jurors, and I don't care what type of expert you have or how. I mean, aren't these the most difficult things for jurors to understand?
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to not quite the extent of like a patent infringement case, but it's one of those things where you have highly technical information and jurors don't know what they're looking at, don't know how they're supposed to be reading it, don't understand what is normal, don't understand what
Yeah.
a normal range is. They don't understand any of it. So they just look at it and like you said, it's just an overflow of information that they just don't understand.
And there's a lot of it. I mean, you get a labor that goes 6, 7, 8 hours. We're talking, and it's just so painful to look at. So you have to present that stuff. But boy, it doesn't, I don't think it necessarily gets either side any, in any way. I don't think there's any advantage necessarily. I do think, again, back to witness prep and witness training, I think the witness that's able to explain it the best, they may not understand it, but that witness is going to have more credibility. So that's why, again, witness performance is so key. Even if they don't understand those fetal monitoring strips, if one witness can outshine another, it's going to make a difference. All
Well,
right.
I think it becomes important there as another one is understanding from a witness and an attorney's perspective that those types of things need to be broken down into more lay terms. I mean, you don't have to
Yeah.
go very, very, very basic where you come across and insult the jurors, but at the same time, you need to take time and really synthesize all the stuff so that it becomes easier because if it's a key piece of information, if people don't understand it, they're not going to use it. And not because they don't want to, it's because they don't know how to.
Got to
So
shift here. Got to get some sunlight so you can actually see me. Okay. Is that better?
that's better, yes.
Okay. Another common theme in these cases, timing of C-sections. I mean, this is something, and another, again, something that jurors just don't understand, and it needs to be explained to them very, very carefully. A C-section is not safe. Okay. I think that everybody thinks like, well, gosh, I mean, you're having these issues. What, just call a C-section, right? Like
Right.
it's some sort of easy way out. And I see in a lot of these cases where there's some issues going on, maybe some decelerations, right? you know, Maybe the pushing is not effective, things like that. And I think a lot of jurors kind of jump to the conclusion. Oh, by the way, are you aware that like in preventative medicine, like how many C-sections are done versus how many should be done by doctors? It's done way too often right now because of this. I think it's because of litigation, is that doctors are like, screw this C-section, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of risk to a C-section. I think in our most recent project, it sounded like the jurors were just like, well, duh, just order it. Like, why are you waiting for a C-section? I mean, I think there's a big misunderstanding there, don't you think?
There is, and I think a couple things on there is if you had a bad outcome from a C-section, then you're going to have the same thing where someone's going to say you did a C-section too soon. Why did you do
Yeah.
it so early? So it's one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't type things. But yeah, I think that is another thing of just understanding that surgeries are inherently risky, and
Yeah.
a doctor is not going to put a patient at risk for that, and be wrong. So they want to make sure they do their due diligence. But to your point, you're screwed either way, because if you make the wrong decision, it's always well, if you'd have just done this, everything would have been fine. And you and I both know that that's not always the case. Especially in the case we're talking about.
Yeah.
The thought, if a C-section was done sooner, is and everything would have been fine. There's nothing to show that. So it's a hollow argument, and it's going to get made by plaintiff's counsel. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean it's so.
Yeah, it's a tough issue. Next thing on the list, and closely related, comes up in all these cases. Your favorite word, Pitocin.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't understand that either. And I think that was probably the biggest part of our project, where probably the most misunderstandings were in, how, why it gets initiated, how it gets titrated, what the appropriate levels are. And what we saw, which I've seen in so many other cases, the big battle was the level of Pitocin versus what the strip was saying, right?
Right.
And the healthcare professionals were, the Pitocin doesn't tell me anything. The fetal monitoring strips was telling me what's going on with the baby. The jurors didn't care about the strip. Well, the only thing they cared about was the level of Pitocin. And I think that's kind of what determined their fate at the end of the focus group, don't you think?
Yeah, and it goes back to what we were talking about not understanding the fetal, strip, because you even said at one point, the fetal strip, that's objective data that they can look at and make decisions.
Yeah.
That objective data is telling you that things are fine. It doesn't matter what the level of Pitocin was. But yeah, jurors were just hung up on it should have only been a certain level. They went above that level, and that caused them all sorts of problems. And to your point, that was one thing they just latched onto and couldn't get away from, was this level of Pitocin. And
yeah, and it was that was really, really tough, and highly related to that. Hospital policies and procedures, that this right here, and with our particular case, it had to do with how Pitocin should be administered to patients. And our providers were outside of that policy, and they thought it was appropriate based on the clinical circumstance. We had angry people on this issue. I mean, when I was shocked, because I remember the question I asked the folks, I'm like, okay, wait a second, does everybody that works here, I go, do you all have policies and procedures in your jobs? And all of them said, yeah, of course. And I go, do you think like policies and procedures represent like a rule book you have to follow? Or are those just kind of general guidelines, but kind of your judgment based on the situation counts more? Remember what happened?
Oh yeah.
The whole room went nuts on me. They're like, oh, that's the rule book. I'm like, well, now wait a second. What do you mean it's the rule book? Oh, well, policy is policy. Those are the rules. And I was trying to, I kind of put my defense attorney cap on. I was trying to convince them, like, but you can't put every situation in a policy. So how could a policy really be a rule? And I saw a lot of illogical arguments and thinking there. I mean, did that not like scare you to death when they started talking about that?
It did. And it was, the funny thing is if you were to put them in the same position and have a situation where they might have broke policy at their employment, they're probably giving you a really good reason on why they did it. Right. And they explained it. This certain situation meant I had to do it and all these things, because inherently, I think they understand that there's exceptions to everything, and that, it depends on the circumstances. But they weren't having it, for the rules for thee, but not for me type thing they were going on. And yeah, it did, when you had brought up a certain situation where you talked about if a patient had fallen out of the bed, if you'd, wash your hands for 30 seconds before you went in and picked them up, and they were, oh, no, you would go in there and pick them up. It's like, well, how's this any different? Well, in this situation, though, that's the rule book. So they were able to kind of mentally do gymnastics to try to fit bits and pieces of when circumstances mattered and then when they didn't.
And then, I mean, then we were, everybody voted on liability. And I think almost 100% of the people that voted yes on liability went right to that policy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You violate a policy, you're liable. Now let's touch on causation and alternative causation, but we're going to talk about that next episode. in a little bit more depth, but particularly, and again, we're not mentioning a names, but when we got to the causation presentations in this jury project, the attorney that was representing the defense essentially, well, I think a juror raised their hand during the Q&A. I think the juror said, well, if it wasn't the Pitocin that caused this, or the too much Pitocin that caused this birth injury, like the plaintiff's attorney said, well, then what happened here? Do you remember his response?
Yeah, essentially, we don't have the burden to
We
prove
don't
that.
have the burden of proof. It's
Yeah.
their job to prove it. They didn't prove it, so I don't have to prove anything. Steve, do you want to tell our audience how that went over?
That did not go over well at all. And
No.
it goes back to, and like I said, we'll talk a little bit more in another episode, but jurors expect some sort of alternate causation. They expect some other type of reason, and to just lay it at the feet of the
Yeah.
plaintiff and say, I don't have to provide anything because they didn't prove their case. Yeah, when in theory, legal theory might actually make sense, the jurors, it doesn't make sense. Jurors are
Yeah.
not going to accept that, and they're not going to buy that.
Yeah. All right. Final thing on my list here, which was another shocker, because it impacted me as a consultant, and that it was a dud. Day in the life video.
Mm.
I thought the day in the life video was brutal. I mean, brutal. And I was like, oh, I just put my hand down. I just put my head in my hand going, oh, we're done. We're done. It didn't carry the weight I thought it would. And I do think that not just necessarily because of COVID, but because of all kinds of crazy things you see and hear on a daily basis. I think today, now, let's put it this way. I think day in the life videos were far more effective pre-social media, pre-political BS. Jurors are so desensitized now, but I was shocked to see that they got really, really angry about the policy issues and got really emotionally into that. Not one of them brought up remember? I took the vote, and I'm like, wait a second. I just took everybody's vote. Not one person voted on sympathy or.
Yeah,
I don't
and
know. That was a pretty brutal video.
Yeah, and when I saw it, and you and I see this all the time, even I saw it and just went, your heart feels for that person, but yeah, and their response was pretty much like, well, when you told us what the injuries were, we knew what the day in the life video was going to show. I mean, so you didn't show us anything we didn't already know. So to your point, I think with social media and a lot of these things now is that people are becoming more aware that there are people that we know that have afflictions that are dealing with certain things. So I think people have gotten less, like you said, more desensitized to it because it just now is becoming more commonplace.
Yeah. So I think we learned a lot. Let's wrap this up here. And I did not plan this question for you, but I trust you to not screw this up. That's an inside joke, everybody. The client decided to start with a focus group in this particular matter rather than a mock trial. And we told them that was the appropriate thing to do. And that's ultimately what they chose. Can you talk about why starting with a mock trial in this particular case probably would have ended up with more questions than answers?
Yeah, I think going back to, we're talking about the alternative causation and other things, allowing us to do the focus group allowed us to really kind of identify those pain points, the whole, the policy issues, the Pitocin issues, understanding of the test strips. These are all things that now having the focus group and realizing those were areas that you needed to focus on, will help to influence and help build out the mock trial so that when you go to the mock trial, you're a lot more armed and ready to explain those things. And like I said, had you gone and done it in a mock trial, you would have left those pieces out much like they did in the focus group. And during deliberations, some of that stuff might not have come up, and you might not have realized how much they were focusing on it, how much they didn't understand the strips, and how much they just weren't following the things that were being presented. So I think doing the focus group was a lot more interactive and allowed them the flexibility for us to really pinpoint and identify those key issues that then, like you said, going forward in the mock trial, you can make sure you hit. And then when it's all said and done, when you do the mock trial, that you'll have a lot more information. You'll have a better case that you
Yeah.
built out, so that you do have a better idea of what it would look like if you were to take it to trial with that information.
Totally agree. Do the exploratory stuff first, get through the headaches, the confusions, the stuff, take a deep dive, figure it out. That's going to result in a better mock trial.
Agreed.
All right. Well, I think this was a very productive episode. We're going to be doing more birth injury cases. So if any of our audience, I know many of our audience members actively are working on cases like this and other complex healthcare litigation, give us a call. We're happy to help. Steve, take us out.
All right. If you need anything, as always, right, you can reach out to Bill at Kanasky, Kanasky at courtroomsciences.com. Reach out to me at swood at courtroomsciences.com. We'll see you on another episode of Litigation Psychology Podcast. Take care.
That's it.